Have you ever played with a magnet and a paperclip? Once you get the paperclip within that magnet's field, it pulls that paperclip into place. I always liked to remove the paperclip and slide it away from the magnet and then start pushing it back toward the magnet, little by little, and see at what point the magnet pulls it in. Now, in some ways, we are like the paperclip, and our habits of thinking and behaving are like the magnet. We might pull ourselves away and decide we're going to do something different. But over time, we can find ourselves inching back toward those old habits until we get pulled in again. Well, that's a helpful analogy to keep in mind when you decide to change from a classroom school to a Charlotte Mason homeschool. Let me explain. Welcome to the Simply Charlotte Mason podcast. I'm Sonia Schaefer. Over the past few weeks, we've been talking about tendencies and tips for those who are making the transition to using a Charlotte Mason approach in their home schools. We all come from different backgrounds, and those backgrounds can act like magnets. It seems like they constantly try to pull our thoughts back in that direction. Today, let me offer 3 tendencies to be aware of, and also give you 3 helpful tips for those of you who are pulling your children out of a classroom setting and beginning to homeschool with the Charlotte Mason method. Or perhaps you are coming out of a classroom setting yourself as a teacher and beginning to homeschool. Both of those scenarios are going to hold some challenges, some magnetic pulls to be aware of. Let's talk first about 3 tendencies to watch for. Tendency number 1, be careful of trying to replicate the classroom in your home setting. Sometimes we get locked into a certain mental picture. School looks like this, and we try to make our homeschool look like school at home. You don't need to be locked into that. The wonderful thing about homeschooling is that you have flexibility, but it might be a challenge coming out of a classroom setting, depending on how long you or your student have been in that situation. You or your children might be used to a predictable schedule, sometimes to the minute, with bells ringing to tell you when to do what. That schedule tells you that you will be done with this class at exactly 11:57, and then you will have lunch until 12:25. Well, such a system may be helpful with a large crowd of students, but it is seldom helpful in a family setting. Try not to get locked into replicating that strict time schedule at home. Some kind of timetable can be helpful. It'll help you to keep moving forward and getting things done in a timely manner. But you can decide what that timetable will look like. You might want a schedule with set times, but another possibility is to create a schedule with time boxes. A time box is much more flexible. With a time box, you can decide, we're going to do these things before lunch, and we're going to do these things after lunch. And it doesn't matter whether you start math at 10:05. This type of schedule doesn't depend on the clock, but on a list of subjects that you plan to do during each of those boxes of time. For example, you might know that you will do math during the morning time box, and it's going to happen between history and poetry. And you can decide what type of timetable is going to fit your family during each season of life. You can enjoy the freedom to do what works best for you. A second tendency also involves the clock. Often in homeschooling, it's easy to feel like you're not doing enough because you're done so much more quickly than in a classroom setting. You might be used to spending 7 or 8 hours in a classroom every day, but rarely is that amount of time necessary in a homeschool. In that one-on-one situation in which you're tutoring one student with one teacher, things go much faster than when you're trying to corral a whole classroom full of children. You will most likely have shorter hours in your home school. But even if you're okay with those shorter school days when you switch to a Charlotte Mason approach, you might feel like you're not accomplishing enough, or your student might feel like she's not accomplishing enough because you don't have a paper trail of worksheets and busy work. It's easy to depend on a paper trail. See, I learned something. This is what I learned. But the Charlotte Mason method is much more organic than that. Your students are learning, but you don't have to fill out a stack of worksheets or create a paper trail to prove it. You know, that mention of worksheets reminds me of another difference that might take some getting used to. You're not going to be teaching to the test. What I mean by teaching to the test is that often in a classroom, the teacher knows what's going to be on the test, and the scores on that test are going to show whether that teacher did a good job or not. So it's not uncommon for the teacher to say, here are the things that are going to be on the test. Learn these things. These are the things you need to learn. Charlotte Mason did not do it that way. She spread a wide feast and let the children take what they were ready for. And when it came time for exam week, there was no reviewing. There was no going over, this is what will be on the test. Charlotte thought that either the children knew it or they didn't. So just be aware that your students might have some transitioning to make in their thinking, and so might you if you were a classroom teacher. It's not, this is what I need to know for the test. It is, this is what I'm learning as a person, and that's all good. Then tendency number 3, beware of using grades to motivate your students. Be cautious of using grades as motivation. Charlotte wanted her schools to teach the joy of knowledge for knowledge's own sake. That was a foundational principle. So try to make learning just a natural part of life. Encourage your students to learn about things they're interested in during non-school hours, too. Try to reignite their natural curiosity, their natural desire for learning that all of us are born with. And sadly, that curiosity often gets schooled out of us and out of our children. Let your students see you learning new things just because you want to, not because there's a grade or a prize involved. Be cautious of using prizes and grades as motivation. When you hold that grade up as the goal, it takes away the value of the knowledge. It sends the message, I'm getting the knowledge just so I can have this prize, not so I can have the knowledge. Do you see the difference? We don't want our children to think about knowledge in that inferior way. The focus should be on the knowledge, not on the grade or the prize. So those are 3 tendencies you might want to watch out for. And let me also give you 3 helpful tips. Tip number 1, if you are coming from a classroom setting, it might be helpful to allow some time to de-school or to decompress. Your students have been programmed to do things a certain way, perhaps for several years now, and they have formed habits of thinking and behaving. The longer they've been doing things a certain way in a classroom setting, the longer it's going to take for their minds to let go of those things. So take some time off at the beginning just to get to know each other again, to make sure your hearts are turned toward each other, and to allow you a fresh start when you're beginning to homeschool. And speaking of starting fresh, tip number 2 is before you start your homeschool, sit down with your kids and discuss how things are going to look different than it did in a classroom setting that they might be used to. Let your students know what to expect. And then give each other grace, especially for those first few weeks, because it might feel uncomfortable. It might almost feel like you're playing school at home. Then for tip number 3, let me just mention that some of these tendencies and tips might apply differently depending on whether your student was doing well in this classroom setting or was struggling, when you decided to take her out and start homeschooling. If your child was the social butterfly and being with those other kids all day just filled up her friendship cup, then you'll want to intentionally schedule time with friends outside of school. You might also want to emphasize the benefits of leisure time that your student is going to have. As I mentioned earlier, you're going to get through the schoolwork much faster. You're not going to be schooling from 8 o'clock to 4 o'clock every day. And your student might not be sure what to do with that leisure time. So encourage her to explore her own interests. Point out how there's much less stress in your family because you're not going to have homework either. You might volunteer as a whole family in your community or in your church. You could discover some old traditions that take some time. You know, those old traditions that can nourish your spirit, like gardening together, or cooking from scratch, or building and making things to use in your home. Even those wonderful traditions of reading aloud as a family or singing together, all of those things are going to enrich your home and help your children discover the joy of leisure that they will have now that they're homeschooling. I hope these thoughts help you make a smoother transition as you get started homeschooling with the Charlotte Mason method. Next time, I'm going to offer 3 tendencies and 3 tips for those who have been using mainly textbooks and workbooks in their homeschool, and they're stepping away from that method to a Charlotte Mason approach. Thanks for joining me. I'll see you next time.